It is the autumn of 1980. Saturday Night Live is back on American television. But something is wrong. The studio audience can feel it. The critics can feel it. And somewhere inside 30 Rockefeller Plaza, the executives at NBC can feel it too, though none of them want to say it out loud yet. The cast that built the show is gone. The producer who created it is gone. The writers who made it dangerous and funny and unlike anything else on television, gone. What remains is a time slot, a studio, and a brand name that NBC has no idea how to protect. Over the next 5 years, Saturday Night Live will come closer to permanent cancellation than at any point in its history. A producer will be fired in disgrace. A cast member will say the most notorious word in television history live on air. NBC will be running the show at $100,000 over budget per episode while the ratings collapse around them. And somehow, through a combination of desperation, luck, and one extraordinary decision, the show will survive. This is the story of how Saturday Night Live nearly destroyed itself, and what it cost to save it. To understand how bad things got, you need to understand how good they had been. Saturday Night Live launched on October 11th, 1975. It was created by Lorne Michaels, a 30-year-old Canadian producer who had convinced NBC to give him a late-night Saturday slot that Johnny Carson had refused to occupy. What Michaels built in Studio 8H at 30 Rockefeller Plaza was unlike anything American television had seen. A live sketch comedy show with a rotating cast of unknowns: Chevy Chase, John Belushi, Dan Aykroyd, Gilda Radner, Jane Curtin, Lorraine Newman, Garrett Morris, who performed live without a net in front of a studio audience every week. By the late 1970s, the show was a cultural institution. Nielsen wasn't measuring total viewers the way we measure them today. The metric that mattered was household share, meaning the percentage of households actively watching television at that hour who chose your show. During seasons 4 and 5, Saturday Night Live was consistently commanding a 40% share in its time slot, in late night, on a Saturday. That is an extraordinary number that most primetime shows would envy, and the advertising revenue reflected it. At its late 1970s peak, SNL was generating an estimated $25 to $30 million annually in gross advertising revenue. For a late-night show, a format that had always been considered secondary to prime time, that was a remarkable figure. Advertisers were paying premium rates to reach the show's audience: young, urban, educated, 18 to 34, and almost impossible to find anywhere else on Saturday night television. Then Lorne Michaels walked away. At the end of season 5, in 1980, Michaels told NBC he was done. He was burned out. 5 years of 90-hour weeks, a volatile cast, network politics, and the relentless pressure of live television had taken their toll. He needed to leave. The original cast followed him out the door. Belushi, Aykroyd, Radner, Chase, Murray, Curtin, all gone within the same summer. NBC was left with a brand name, a studio, and absolutely nobody to fill it. The person NBC chose to replace Michaels was a woman named Doumanian. She had worked as a talent coordinator on the original show, connected to Michaels socially, familiar with the show's culture, and available. What she had never done was run a live television production of this scale, manage a writer's room, or handle the week-to-week pressure of delivering 90 minutes of live comedy to a national audience. NBC hired her anyway. Doumanian assembled a new cast that included Charles Rocket, Denny Dillon, Gilbert Gottfried, Gail Mathias, and several others. Some of them were genuinely talented. All of them were thrown into an impossible situation: a show with no infrastructure, no experienced writing staff, no institutional knowledge, and an audience that was already comparing them unfavorably to the people they had replaced. The first episode of Season 6 aired on November 15, 1980. The reviews were immediate and devastating. Tom Shales of The Washington Post, the most influential television critic in America at the time, described the new cast as pale carbon copies of the original stars. The phrase stuck. Other critics were equally brutal. The consensus formed rapidly. This was not Saturday Night Live. This was something wearing Saturday Night Live's clothes. The ratings reflected it. By the end of Season 6, household ratings had dropped by approximately 10 to 11% compared to the final season under Michaels. For a show that had been commanding premium advertising rates based on those ratings, this was commercially significant. The $35,000 to $45,000 that advertisers were now paying for a 30-second spot on SNL was notably lower than the pricing the show had commanded during its peak years, and advertisers knew it. NBC was watching one of its most valuable late-night properties deteriorate in real time. And then, Charles Rocket made everything worse. On February 21, 1981, at approximately 1 a.m. Eastern Time, Charles Rocket said the F word on live national television. It was not planned, it was not a stunt. It happened at the end of a sketch, a parody of the television show Dallas, when Rocket, apparently improvising, used the expletive in response to a question from a cast member. Here is what is interesting about the legal and financial aftermath. There was none. Because the incident occurred during late hours, it fell within the FCC's safe harbor hours, the period during which broadcast content restrictions are relaxed. NBC faced no regulatory fine. No federal broadcast regulations were technically violated. What NBC faced instead was something arguably worse: internal outrage, affiliate complaints, and a public scandal at precisely the moment when the show could least afford one. The story dominated entertainment news coverage for weeks. It became the symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the new SNL, a show so chaotic and undirected that its cast members were saying the unsayable on live national television without anyone stopping them. For Jean Doumanian, it was the final blow. She was fired in March 1981. The man NBC brought in to replace her was Dick Ebersol. Ebersol had real credentials. He had been one of the original architects of SNL, working alongside Michaels in the show's earliest planning stages before moving into broader network roles. He understood what the show was supposed to be. He understood why it was failing. And he was given a clear brief from NBC executives, including network head Brandon Tartikoff. Fix it, or they would cancel it. This was not a hypothetical. Tartikoff and NBC executive Don Carswell had seriously discussed pulling the plug. The show was running approximately $100,000 over budget per episode. The ratings did not justify the mounting costs. In 1982, Tartikoff made a decision that captured exactly how precarious things were. Rather than renewing SNL for the standard 22-episode season, he granted Ebersol a shortened 13-episode renewal. A trial. A last chance to prove the show was worth keeping. Ebersol looked at what he had inherited and made immediate changes. He restructured the cast and the writer's room. He brought in new talent, including a young Joe Piscopo who would become one of the show's anchors in the seasons that followed. And then he looked at the one performer who had been consistently getting laughs all season, even when everything around him was collapsing. A 19-year-old featured player from Roosevelt, Long Island, named Eddie Murphy. Murphy had auditioned for the show in 1980 and been offered a position as a featured player rather than a full cast member, a junior role that came with less screen time, less pay, and no guarantee of prominence. He took it anyway. He was 19 years old and he wanted to be on Saturday Night Live. During season 6, while the rest of the cast struggled, Murphy was doing something different. He was watching. He was studying the rhythms of the studio, learning what worked in front of a live audience, developing characters with a focus and discipline that the chaos around him hadn't disrupted. When he did get screen time, which was limited because the show's dysfunction had not prioritized him, he used it precisely. His Mr. Robinson's neighborhood character, his buckwheat impression, his James Brown. These were fully constructed comedic ideas, each built around a specific insight, each landing consistently with audiences who were otherwise tuning out. Ebersol recognized it immediately. In the restructure that followed Doumanian's firing, Murphy was moved to the center of the show. More screen time, more support, a clearer mandate, be the reason people tune in. Murphy responded. Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood became appointment television. The sketch, a parody of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, set in an inner-city apartment, ran as a recurring bit throughout the early 1980s and became one of the most recognizable things SNL had produced since the Belushi era. It was funny on the surface and pointed underneath, a portrait of urban poverty and neglect in Reagan's America, a commentary the show would not otherwise have had the language to make. Buckwheat, Murphy's revival of the Our Gang character, is more complicated. Murphy played a grown-up version of the original child character with a deliberately absurdist, garbled delivery that audiences found irresistible. But by early 1983, Murphy had grown exhausted by the relentless fan demands to do buckwheat. He went to Ebersol directly and asked to kill the character, which resulted in an elaborate on-screen assassination sketch that let him retire the bit on his own terms. That tells you something important about Murphy's relationship with his own work. He was always the one deciding what his characters meant and when they were finished. What's less well documented is the broader experience of being a young black performer at the center of a show that had not been built for him. Garrett Morris, the original SNL's only black cast member who served for 5 seasons from 1975 to 1980, has been direct about what that culture felt like. Even on a radical show that was trying to be new and improved, Morris told interviewers, I, as a black member, did have difficulty getting on. I had to fight to get people to write for me. Of the writer's room, Morris said plainly, Lorne's writers had a lot of racism going on, and reflecting on his 5 years as the only non-white performer in the cast, Morris summed it up with a line that stays with you. I created the chair for the non-white performer. Murphy inherited that chair. What he did with it, and what the institution around him did and didn't do to support him, shaped everything that followed. The ratings began to recover. By mid-season 7, SNL was back in commercially viable territory. Not where it had been under Michaels, but stable, profitable, worth keeping on the air. NBC exhaled. But here is what the ratings recovery doesn't tell you. Eddie Murphy wasn't just saving SNL's television numbers. He was making a $400 million business viable again. Let's talk about what Saturday Night Live was actually worth, because the numbers are where this story becomes genuinely extraordinary. At its commercial peak in the late 1970s, SNL was generating an estimated $25 to $30 million annually in gross advertising revenue. For a late-night show, a format the industry had always considered secondary. That was remarkable. By the end of season 6, advertisers were paying $35,000 to $45,000 for a 30-second spot. Down, significantly down from those peak years. But advertising revenue is only part of the picture. The larger value of Saturday Night Live, the reason NBC fought to keep it alive rather than filling the time slot with something cheaper, was its value as a platform, as a machine that produced celebrities. The original cast had demonstrated this. John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd made The Blues Brothers in 1980 on a production budget of $27.5 million. It grossed $115.2 million at the worldwide box office. Chevy Chase had a film career. Bill Murray was a movie star. The pattern was clear. SNL was not just a television show, it was an incubator. a place where performers could build a national profile and then translate it into something much larger. Eddie Murphy was about to prove this more dramatically than anyone before him. In 1982, he made 48 Hours with Nick Nolte. He was 21 years old. He had never appeared in a feature film. Paramount was taking a calculated risk on an SNL featured player in a leading role in a major action comedy. 48 Hours was produced on a $12 million budget and grossed $78.9 million worldwide. Eddie Murphy was now a proven box office draw. Trading Places followed in 1983, produced on a $15 million budget. It grossed $120.6 million worldwide. Then came Beverly Hills Cop in 1984. Produced on a budget of $13 to $14 million. It grossed $234.7 million in North America alone and $316.3 million worldwide. It was the highest-grossing film of 1984, one of the most profitable comedies in Hollywood history. Here is what those numbers meant for NBC and for SNL specifically. Every time Murphy succeeded at the box office, it proved something to the entertainment industry about what SNL was worth. Television and Wall Street analysts in the 1980s began describing the show explicitly as an incubator of talent, an asset whose value extended far beyond what you could capture on a ratings report or an advertising rate card. And this assessment has been validated in remarkable ways. Characters and formats created on SNL spawned successful Hollywood franchises, The Blues Brothers, Wayne's World, generating hundreds of millions in box office revenue. When NBC Universal finally moved to formalize this value, they approached Lorne Michaels in 2015 to buy back his ownership stake in SNL. The deal was reportedly worth several $100 million. That is what the franchise was worth to one of the largest media companies in the world, based on what it had built since Eddie Murphy walked onto that stage in 1980. NBC executives Brandon Tartikoff and Chairman Grant Tinker came to understand this before anyone else in the industry. Rather than canceling SNL during its rocky post-Michaels period, they recognized that the show's franchise value, its status as the defining talent factory in American comedy, was worth protecting even through commercially difficult periods. In retrospective interviews and accounts, such as Saturday Night, a backstage history of Saturday Night Live, Ebersol noted that network management realized they could not sustain the franchise without its core draw, forcing NBC to treat the show as an evolving investment rather than a disposable block of late-night time. Murphy didn't just stabilize the show's finances in the short term. He changed the economic logic of what the show was. Before Murphy, SNL's commercial value was essentially about its weekly audience. The show was worth what advertisers would pay to reach them each Saturday night. After Murphy, SNL's value included something far more durable, its status as the place where the next generation of American comedy stars would emerge. That status was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and it was worth it because of a decision Dick Ebersol made out of desperation in 1981. But here is what the success story conceals. The Eddie Murphy era at SNL was not a smooth rescue narrative. It was complicated, uncomfortable, and in some respects, unresolved to this day. From the beginning, Murphy occupied a position that had no real precedent in SNL's history. He was black in a show that had been, and largely remained, a predominantly white institution. In its cast, its writing staff, its sensibility, its cultural references, the institutional context matters here. Garrett Morris, the original SNL's only black cast member for its first 5 seasons, had spent his time on the show fighting for basic equity. "I had to fight to get people to write for me," Morris said. He remembered suggesting to writers early in his tenure that he play a doctor in a sketch, only to be told that it might throw the audience. He navigated this by elevating whatever he was given, developing characters like Chico Escuela to outwit the limitations placed around him. When he reflected on what he had accomplished in 5 years, Morris was clear-eyed. "I created the chair for the non-white performer." Murphy sat in that chair. And the show's writer's room in the early 1980s was the same institutional culture Morris had described, with the same structural limitations, the same blind spots, the same capacity to underserve a performer whose experience and reference points the white writers around him didn't share. Murphy has spoken about this in terms of race and of the personal cost of being simultaneously the show's most valuable asset and someone operating within a culture that wasn't built for him. In a Rolling Stone interview, he was blunt about what he experienced. "You have to remember, there was no hip-hop back then. For years, I'm the whipping boy. Anybody that wanted to vent, I was the one. I got a lot of flack that wasn't fair. The root of it was racist." This tension shaped his work in ways that are visible in retrospect. Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood, when you watch it now, is not simply a parody of a children's television show. It is sustained social commentary, a portrait of urban poverty, of neglect, of the gap between the America being celebrated in Reagan's Morning in America rhetoric and the America that actually existed in the neighborhoods Murphy was drawing on. The show got that commentary because Murphy put it there. It would not have existed otherwise. The buckwheat situation tells a different but related story about control. Murphy played the character on his own terms, with a deliberate absurdism that he controlled entirely. But by early 1983, the relentless audience demand, "Do buckwheat," at every public appearance, had become exhausting. Murphy went to Ebersol and asked to kill the character. The result was an elaborate on-screen assassination sketch that let him retire buckwheat permanently on his schedule, in his way. What is less well known is what Murphy did quietly around this same period. Billy Thomas, the actor who had originally played buckwheat as a child in the Our Gang films, died in 1980. Murphy, who maintained deep respect for Thomas's work, secretly paid for a tombstone to be placed on Thomas's grave. He didn't talk about it. He just did it. That detail, a young performer at the peak of his powers, quietly paying tribute to the person whose legacy he had inherited, tells you something about how seriously Murphy took the weight of what he was doing. Then there is the question of credit. Murphy left SNL in 1984 after season 9. By that point, his film career had completely eclipsed the show in terms of his cultural profile. Beverly Hills Cop, which he made while still technically an SNL cast member, had just become the highest-grossing film of the year. He was not leaving a sinking ship. He was leaving a show he had saved. The way SNL's history came to be told, in anniversary specials, documentaries, the official narrative the show constructed about itself, sometimes positioned Murphy's success as something the show had given him, rather than something he had accomplished while rescuing an institution that was otherwise finished. Murphy pushed back on this. When he accepted the Mark Twain Prize for American Humor at the Kennedy Center in 2015, delivering his first live stand-up performance in 28 years, he was direct about the historical record. The implication was clear. The show had needed him more than he had needed it. The story that SNL made Eddie Murphy had the causality backwards. He had a point. The numbers support him. So where does the story end up? By 1985, Saturday Night Live had stabilized. The chaos era, the Doumanian disaster, the rocket incident, the near cancellation, the 13-episode ultimatum from Tartikoff, the desperate restructure under Ebersol, was over. The show had survived, but it had not simply returned to what it was before. It had been fundamentally changed by what it had been through. The most significant change was structural. In Season 10, the 1984 to 1985 season, Ebersol assembled what critics would call an all-star cast: Billy Crystal, Martin Short, Christopher Guest, and Harry Shearer. The season received broadly positive notices for the sheer talent it contained. Martin Short introduced Ed Grimley, Billy Crystal brought Fernando Lamas. The ratings stabilized following the departures of Murphy and Piscopo. But there was a tension. Many of these performers came from scripted alternative comedy backgrounds, short from SCTV, guest from This Is Spinal Tap. The season leaned heavily on pre-taped segments and mockumentary formats. Some critics and longtime viewers felt the show had drifted from the raw, live sketch energy that had always been its identity. Then Ebersol left, and Lorne Michaels came back. Season 11, Michaels' return in 1985 to 1986, was, by almost every account, a disaster. Michaels hired established Hollywood actors rather than seasoned sketch comedians. Robert Downey Jr., Anthony Michael Hall, Joan Cusack, among others. The experiment yielded universally harsh reviews and catastrophic ratings. The show came closer to cancellation in season 11 than it had even during the Doumanian era. This is important context for understanding what Michaels had actually inherited. He hadn't returned to a restored institution. He had returned to a show that was still fragile, that had been stabilized by Ebersol and Murphy during the early 1980s, but had not yet found its next identity. Michaels spent several more seasons working out what the post-Murphy version of SNL looked like. He found it in season 12 and beyond, with a cast that would ultimately include Dana Carvey, Phil Hartman, Jan Hooks, Mike Myers, Chris Farley, Adam Sandler, Chris Rock, performers who defined American comedy for a generation. None of them get their SNL platform if the show is canceled in 1982. None of the cultural output that followed exists. The financial trajectory captures all of this. By the early 1990s, SNL was generating $70 to $80 million in annual advertising revenue. By 1992, trade publications were describing it as NBC's most profitable scripted television program. The production costs remained relatively low compared to prime-time network programming, creating substantial profit margins. The Bad Boys era, Myers, Farley, Sandler, Rock, Hartman, Carvey, was producing not just ratings, but commercially repeatable catchphrase culture and film spin-offs, Wayne's World alone generating hundreds of millions at the box office. Today, the picture is even more striking. SNL generates approximately $75 to $85 million in annual advertising revenue. As recently as 2021, that figure was $85.3 million. While production costs run approximately $4 million per episode, totaling roughly $85 to $100 million for a full season. On a pure linear broadcast basis, the show operates near break-even, but its value to NBC Universal extends far beyond the linear numbers. Exclusive streaming rights on Peacock, generating an estimated $50 million annually in subscriber value, global licensing fees, and its continued function as a talent pipeline for the broader NBC Universal ecosystem. Lorne Michaels' personal net worth is estimated at $500 million, largely derived from his ownership stake in SNL and its spin-off intellectual property. When NBC Universal moved to buy back his half of that stake in 2015, the deal was reportedly worth several $100 million. That is what the franchise is worth to one of the largest media companies in the world. And it begins, all of it, with a decision made in a moment of institutional panic in 1981. Here is the question I want to leave you with. Everything I have told you in the last 20-plus minutes is, by the historical record, accurate. The timeline is correct. The numbers are verified. The causality is real. The chaos years nearly destroyed Saturday Night Live, and one extraordinary performer at the center of one correct decision by one producer saved it. But here is where reasonable people genuinely disagree. Did SNL deserve to survive the chaos era? Or did they get lucky? The case that they deserved it. The decision to hire Dick Ebersol was a good decision, made quickly once it became clear that Doumanian couldn't do the job. Ebersol correctly identified Murphy. Tartikoff and Grant Tinker correctly recognized the franchise's long-term value and protected it even when the short-term numbers were bad. These were not obvious calls. They required institutional courage and good judgment under pressure. The case that they got lucky: NBC hired a producer who was unqualified for the role. They gave her inadequate support. They let the show deteriorate for a full season, losing audience, losing advertiser confidence, generating the Charles Rocket incident before acting. The recovery worked because Eddie Murphy happened to be in that featured player slot. If he hadn't auditioned, if he had taken a different job, if Ebersol hadn't had the eye to see what Murphy was doing in the margins of a failing show, there is no happy ending. The show gets canceled in 1982, and 50 years of American comedy history simply does not happen. That is not institutional resilience. That is a near miss that got extraordinarily lucky. I think both are true simultaneously, which is what makes the chaos era so genuinely interesting as a business case study. The system failed. The people inside it, at the critical moment when it mattered, made the right calls. And the combination of systemic failure and individual excellence produced one of the most durable entertainment franchises in American history. What I want you to think about, and what I want you to argue about in the comments, is this. Brandon Tartikoff gave Dick Ebersol only 13 episodes to save Saturday Night Live. Was that the right call? Or was it an ultimatum that could easily have gone wrong? If Ebersol had been given a full 22-episode season and the pressure had been lower, does he make the same bold decision to center everything on a 19-year-old featured player? Or does the reduced runway, the knowledge that he had 13 episodes and nothing more, force exactly the kind of decisive thinking that saved the show? There is no obvious answer. The pressure might have been the point. Drop your take below.